Mr. Harrison Blake was one of those men everyone in the city knew, a billionaire who had built an empire out of real estate, luxury hotels, and art collections. His mansion stood like a palace on a hill, with glass walls that reflected the sunlight and expensive sculptures that only a few could afford to look at, let alone buy. He had everything a man could want: wealth, power, fame, and respect. But what he didn't have was humility. Harrison liked to play games with people. He often tested those who worked for him, not out of kindness but out of amusement. He enjoyed seeing people struggle to impress him. His mansion was always full of staff: chefs, drivers, gardeners, and housekeepers, all working quietly and carefully, trying not to make a mistake around their boss. Among them was a man named Samuel, the housekeeper who had worked there for years. Samuel was not like the others. He was calm, quiet, and always polite. He never complained about long hours or hard work. He lived in a small room in the servants' quarters behind the mansion. Though he didn't say much, everyone respected him for his honesty and humble nature. He had come from a small African village many years ago, where his late grandfather had been a teacher. Samuel often remembered his grandfather's voice, the stories, lessons, and even the strange old languages he had taught him as a child. Those memories were his treasures. One bright morning, Harrison Blake was in a cheerful mood. He had just returned from an art auction where he'd bought an old framed letter that was said to be written in a forgotten African dialect. He brought it home and showed it off to his guests. "They say no one in the country can translate this," he said proudly, sipping his coffee. "It's supposed to be priceless, but without translation, it's just paper." One of his friends laughed. "Maybe you can offer a reward to anyone who can read it." That gave Harrison an idea. He smirked and turned to his staff, who were quietly cleaning around the living room. "All right," he said loudly. "Let's make this fun. Whoever can translate this letter gets my fortune. Every dollar." Imagine that. The staff froze. Some smiled awkwardly, thinking it was just another one of his jokes. Others laughed nervously, knowing he loved teasing them. No one took it seriously. A few seconds later, laughter filled the room again. But not Samuel. He didn't laugh. He just stood there holding a tray, his eyes fixed on the letter. The handwriting looked familiar. The loops, the curves, the symbols. It stirred something deep in his memory. He remembered sitting under a mango tree as a child, while his grandfather traced similar letters in the sand with a stick. Samuel blinked, realizing this was the same language, an old dialect his grandfather had once called the voice of the ancestors. He wanted to speak, but he hesitated. How could a housekeeper standing with a tray of cups tell a billionaire that he might understand something? Even experts couldn't. It sounded impossible even to him, so he stayed silent. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Samuel quietly returned to the living room. The letter was still there, lying on the table beside a glass sculpture. He picked it up carefully. The paper was yellowed with age and the ink had faded, but the symbols were still visible. He sat on the floor under the warm lamp and began to whisper the words to himself. As he read, memories rushed back: his grandfather's voice, the songs, the meanings. It was like solving a puzzle piece by piece. The letter spoke of a man who had traveled across the ocean to a new land, carrying something valuable, something hidden. Samuel didn't understand all of it yet, but it was clear this was not just an ordinary message. It was personal. Meanwhile, upstairs, Harrison Blake was still awake, watching the city lights through his window. He felt bored despite his wealth. For some reason, he kept thinking about that old letter. What if someone really could read it? He smiled at the idea. No one could. It was just an old piece of mystery he liked showing off. But downstairs in that quiet room, something important was happening, something that would soon change both of their lives. Samuel copied a few words on a small piece of paper, trying to understand the full message. It wasn't easy. The language was ancient, filled with symbols that carried deep meanings. But Samuel was patient. Every night after his work, he came back to that same spot, studying and whispering the words softly. Days passed. Harrison continued with his usual life: meetings, parties, laughter. He had already forgotten about his challenge, but Samuel hadn't. The more he read, the clearer the message became. The letter was written by one of Harrison's ancestors, a man who had once lived in Africa many generations ago. It talked about a promise, about something hidden away that belonged to both his descendants and the people who had helped him survive a long time ago. The realization made Samuel's heart race. This wasn't just a letter. It was history, and he was probably the only living person who could truly read it. One afternoon, while cleaning the study, Samuel overheard Mr. Blake telling a guest, "That old letter is still a mystery. I guess it'll stay that way forever." Something in Samuel stirred. Maybe it was time to tell the truth. That night he gathered his courage. He practiced his words in front of the mirror. "Sir, I think I can translate it." He whispered the sentence again and again until it didn't sound too bold. The next morning, as the mansion prepared for another busy day, Samuel took a deep breath and walked toward Mr. Blake's office. The billionaire was sitting behind his desk reading the newspaper. Samuel stopped at the door and said softly, "Sir, about the letter you mentioned, I think I can understand it." Harrison looked up, amused. "You understand it?" He laughed. "You're a housekeeper, Samuel, not a historian." Samuel didn't argue. He just nodded and said, "I know, sir. But please, give me a chance to show you." There was something in Samuel's calm, respectful voice that made the billionaire pause. He leaned back in his chair and smiled, half out of curiosity and half out of disbelief. "All right then," he said with a chuckle. "Go ahead. Surprise me." And as Samuel carefully unfolded the old letter, Harrison had no idea that the words about to come out of that humble man's mouth would soon change everything he believed about wealth, history, and fate. When Samuel stood in front of Mr. Blake's desk, his hands were shaking slightly, but his voice remained calm. The letter looked old and fragile in his hands, as if it had been waiting years for someone to finally read it aloud. Harrison leaned back in his chair, amused. He didn't believe the quiet housekeeper could do anything special. But something about Samuel's serious face made him curious enough to listen. Samuel took a deep breath and started reading softly. His voice was low at first, uncertain, but as he went on, it grew stronger. The language was ancient, filled with deep meaning and strange rhythm. Harrison raised his eyebrows. The sounds were unlike anything he had heard before. Samuel paused for a moment, then began translating the words into English. "The letter says," Samuel began, "that this was written by Lord Benjamin Blake, your great-great-grandfather. He wrote it while traveling through Africa over 100 years ago. He speaks about the people who helped him survive when he fell ill during his journey." Harrison frowned. "Go on," he said, suddenly more serious. Samuel continued, reading carefully and translating every line. "He says he was saved by a village chief and his family. Out of gratitude, he left behind a hidden gift, something valuable, buried under a sacred tree near the place where he recovered. He promised that his future family must share that gift with the descendants of the people who once saved him." As Samuel's voice filled the quiet room, Harrison's smirk slowly disappeared. The story sounded unbelievable, yet somehow it felt true. The handwriting on the letter was identical to other family documents he had seen before. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, listening closely. Samuel didn't stop there. He turned the letter around and read the small lines written at the bottom. "It also says," Samuel added softly, "that whoever finds this letter must be a person of honesty and humility, not driven by greed. The letter warns that the fortune it speaks of will bring peace only to those who use it wisely." A silence hung in the air after Samuel finished reading. Harrison blinked as if waking up from a dream. For years he had thought of wealth as a game, something to show off. Now he sat speechless before a simple housekeeper who had just revealed a secret buried in his family's history. "You're telling me," Harrison finally said, "that my ancestor left behind something, and that this letter is real?" Samuel nodded. "Yes, sir. I believe so. The language, the style, even the words he used, they all match the old dialect my grandfather taught me. It's not just a story. It's a message." Harrison stood up, pacing across the room. "Unbelievable," he murmured. "Historians couldn't figure this out. Museums tried for years." "And you just did it?" Samuel smiled humbly. "I didn't do anything special, sir. I just remembered what my grandfather taught me. He always said knowledge is not about titles. It's about patience and respect." For the first time in years, Harrison Blake didn't have a clever reply. He stared at the letter again, realizing it was more than an old collectible. It was a part of his family's forgotten story. The words about gratitude, honesty, and sharing wealth began to echo in his mind. A few hours later, Harrison called his lawyer and asked for all the old documents related to his ancestors' travels. He wanted proof, something to confirm Samuel's translation. The lawyer brought several old maps and journals. To everyone's surprise, one of the maps had a small X mark in the same area described in the letter, deep in the heart of an old African village that still existed today. Harrison's eyes widened. This can't be a coincidence, he turned to Samuel. You said your grandfather taught you that language. Where was he from? Samuel smiled faintly. From a small village near the same region mentioned here, sir. My grandfather said his own father once helped a sick traveler who came from far away, a man with blue eyes and a strange accent. Harrison froze. The description matched his ancestor perfectly. He felt a chill run down his spine. Everything fit. The letter, the map, the story. He realized Samuel wasn't just a housekeeper who could read an old language. He was the descendant of the very people who had once saved his ancestor's life. The realization hit Harrison like a wave. For the first time, he felt both humbled and grateful. He had spent his life surrounded by riches, but right now, standing before this modest man, he felt small, as if life had brought him full circle to repay an old debt his family had forgotten. He cleared his throat, trying to sound casual, but his voice trembled slightly. Samuel, he said, I owe you more than I can say. You've not only solved a mystery but reminded me of something important, that gratitude travels through generations. Samuel bowed his head slightly. I'm just glad I could help, sir. Maybe your ancestor wanted this message to be found now, at the right time. That night, Harrison couldn't sleep. He sat in his library, staring at the letter under the lamp. The words kept replaying in his mind. Only those with honesty and humility will find peace in this fortune. He thought about all the years he had spent chasing wealth and power, forgetting kindness and respect. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of those words deeply. The next morning, Harrison made a decision. He called Samuel to his study again. Pack your bags, he said. Samuel looked confused. Sir? We're going to Africa, Harrison said with a smile. We're going to find out if what your grandfather and my ancestor started together still exists. Samuel couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never traveled since leaving his village many years ago. The thought of going back, and not as a servant but as an equal companion on an important mission, made his heart race. As they prepared for the journey, the news spread through the mansion. The other workers couldn't believe it. The billionaire and the housekeeper were going on a trip together, something that sounded impossible just a week ago. When the day came, Samuel looked around the grand house one last time, remembering all the quiet nights he had spent cleaning those shiny floors. Now he was walking beside the man who once treated him like a shadow. Life had changed in ways he never imagined. On the flight, Harrison turned to Samuel and said softly, You know, when I first saw you reading that letter, I thought it was just a game. But now I think it was fate, Samuel smiled. Maybe fate was waiting for both of us to learn something, sir. As the plane flew high above the clouds, neither of them spoke for a while. They both knew this was not just a journey to find hidden treasure. It was something much greater, a journey to uncover truth, gratitude, and the bond between two families separated by history, but reunited by a simple act of understanding. And though neither of them could predict what awaited in that faraway village, one thing was certain: the billionaire's life was about to change forever, thanks to the housekeeper who dared to translate the words that others ignored. The journey to Africa was long and filled with excitement, curiosity, and a quiet tension. Samuel had never flown in a plane before, and Harrison, despite all his wealth, felt a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Neither of them knew exactly what they would find, but both felt that this trip could change everything. As they flew over oceans and mountains, Samuel kept the old letter close to his chest, reading it again and again, making sure he remembered every word. When they finally landed, they were greeted by a village that seemed frozen in time. The trees were tall, the air smelled of fresh earth, and children ran through the dusty paths with laughter that reminded Samuel of his childhood. Harrison, who had always lived among concrete, glass, and steel, looked around in awe. The simplicity, warmth, and life of the village struck him in a way money never could. Samuel took the lead, guided by his grandfather's memories and the descriptions in the letter. They walked through narrow paths, past huts with thatched roofs and over small streams that sparkled in the sun. Harrison noticed the villagers staring at them, curious but welcoming. Samuel greeted them in the local dialect, and the people's eyes lit up with recognition and respect. After hours of walking, they reached a hill near the edge of the village. According to the letter, the hidden treasure was buried under a large sacred tree that stood at the top. Samuel's heart pounded as he looked at the tree. Its thick roots twisted into the earth as if holding centuries of stories beneath them. He remembered his grandfather telling him that some treasures are not just gold or silver, but lessons and memories that last forever. Harrison knelt down beside Samuel, watching carefully as Samuel began to dig near the roots of the tree. Hours passed. Sweat ran down their faces, but Samuel's determination never wavered. He knew this wasn't just about wealth. It was about honoring the past. Finally, his hand hit something solid. He carefully pulled it out. It was a small wooden chest worn by time but still intact. Samuel opened it slowly. Inside, they found gold coins, jewelry, and papers that detailed Harrison's ancestors' promises to the villagers who had helped him survive. More importantly, the chest included letters of gratitude, showing that the fortune was always meant to be shared with those who had helped his family generations ago. Harrison looked at Samuel, speechless. "You did it," Harrison whispered, his voice trembling. "You really did it," Samuel smiled humbly. "We did it, sir. Your ancestors' words guided us, and my grandfather's memory helped me understand them." Harrison felt a deep respect for Samuel, deeper than he had ever felt for anyone before. The housekeeper, who had quietly worked in the mansion for years, had just changed his life and reminded him of something he had long forgotten: the power of honesty, humility, and gratitude. After returning to the village, Harrison insisted on sharing the treasure with the villagers. Gold coins were distributed, letters were read aloud, and the story of Benjamin Blake's promise was told. Samuel helped explain everything, translating the documents for the people. The villagers were overjoyed, not just by the wealth but by the recognition of their ancestors' kindness. Harrison watched, amazed. For the first time in his life, he felt true happiness, not from owning wealth, but from sharing it and witnessing the joy it brought to others. He looked at Samuel and realized that the quiet man who had once simply cleaned his mansion had more wisdom and courage than most people he knew. When the trip ended and they returned home, Harrison made a decision that shocked his lawyers and staff. He legally honored his promise. Samuel was given a significant share of the fortune, enough to live comfortably and pursue any dreams he wished. But Samuel, as humble as ever, did not flaunt the wealth. He continued to live simply, helping others and using the money wisely. Harrison, on the other hand, transformed in ways no one could have expected. He became more compassionate, more thoughtful, and more aware of the people around him. He started charitable programs, built schools in the village they had visited, and made sure the legacy of gratitude continued. People in his life noticed the change, and many wondered what had caused it. Only Harrison and Samuel knew the real story: how an old letter, patience, and humility had transformed a billionaire's heart. As years went by, Samuel's life changed in quiet but meaningful ways. He traveled, learned new skills, and helped document the history of the village and its people. He became known not just as a housekeeper who once translated an ancient letter, but as a man who bridged two worlds: the world of wealth and the world of wisdom passed down through generations. Harrison never forgot that day when Samuel read the letter. He often said, "A fortune is meaningless without the heart to use it wisely." Samuel taught me that. And Samuel, smiling softly, would reply, "My real fortune was the lessons my grandfather gave me, sir. The rest is just history." Years later, when children in the village asked Samuel about the treasure, he would kneel down, point to the trees and the streams, and tell them stories of courage, honesty, and gratitude. He never made the story about himself. He spoke about the importance of listening, remembering, and honoring those who came before. Harrison and Samuel remained lifelong friends. Their bond, born from an old letter in a forgotten language, became a story they shared only with those they trusted. People often asked Harrison if he still laughed at challenges and games. He would smile gently and say, "The real challenge is life itself, understanding it, respecting it, and helping those around you." The mansion in New York was no longer just a symbol of wealth. It became a home where lessons were remembered, kindness was celebrated, and the story of the letter was passed down through generations. And every time Harrison looked at Samuel, he remembered the day a quiet housekeeper's wisdom changed not only his fortune, but his heart. In the end, the letter had done more than revealed treasure. It had revealed truth. It had shown that integrity, humility, and respect could transform lives, bridge cultures, and leave a legacy far greater than gold. Samuel's jaw-dropping translation had not just unlocked a fortune, it had unlocked hearts, inspired change, and proved that sometimes the smallest, quietest people carry the most powerful lessons.